For our second project, we're going to be doing shadows and highlights. So some of you are very familiar with this already if you've had me before. We've talked about value. Value is one of our most important elements of art that we've talked about so far. So if you aren't familiar with it or you need a little refresher, value is not how much money you have as much as you want to think it is. Value is actually, in art, about how light or how dark something is. So how much light, how much darkness. That's our value in art. I'm going to be giving you a quick demonstration to help you get through the shadow highlight worksheet and to come up with some ways to help you get prepared for that next assignment too. So go ahead, pull out that worksheet, get ready to go, and you can follow along or just watch before we get started.
So the first handout that we're going to be working on today is our shadow highlight worksheet. It's going to look something like this. I have a hand-drawn copy, you have a printed one. So it's going to look a little bit different, but about the same. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this shape. It's called a dodecahedron. However, I think it's much more preferable to recognize it as a 12-sided dice, which I have an abundance of. So we're going to be looking at the shape. Having this object might help us to kind of figure out a better idea of what highlights and shadows are going to look like on a 3D object. So let's look at this first. This is the example that they gave us, essentially. Right now I've got a couple different examples already filled in for you because you saw that it had those lines and numbers asking you to fill them in. I'm not too worried about that part. You can just worry about listening to what I'm saying to you right now. I'll explain some of these words and you can just do the value on the blank sheet. When we look at the 12-sided dice, we're going to notice first the most obvious to answer is what the highlight is. So our highlight is going to be that lightest, brightest area on our shape, on our object. So we can see it right here in that bright white space. Same thing for our sphere, our 3D circle shape. We've got that highlight right in the middle. What that is where the light is hitting our object. So think about it this way. We've got a little pretty light. We'll call it our lamp up in this corner, for example. That lamp is shining light onto this object from an angle. It's not coming from straight up and down or what would be highlighted, the top, right? So right now our light source is coming from an angle. I know this because my highlight is on the edge. When I'm looking, I can see that highlight, and that light source, knowing where that light source is going to help me figure out where all the other shadows and lights are going to go. So if I'm looking at my light source, I know this is my highlight. So I can think about it this way. I know this spot right here, I don't really have to do much to it. It's light, it's bright, there's nothing to shade in. My value is going to come in wherever that light is not touching. So when that light hits this spot on the shape, can it go all the way to this other side? Probably not. It's going to hit that spot and it's not going to have a lot of other places for it to shine on. So the part that's on the opposite side, farthest away from that light, is going to have the darkest area because that light doesn't have any room to reach it. So my highlight's going to be right where that light hits directly, but the opposite side of that is where we're going to have our darkest shade. So I have my shadows here, and everything in between is kind of a medium mid-tone. So it's a shaded area because it's not getting that direct light, but it's still not quite as dark as our shadow area. Our core shadow is what this is called, because it's still getting a little bit of light reflected from the area around it. So when we go to fill in our shape, I want you to think about the way you hold your pencil. So usually when we draw, we would hold our pencil kind of like this, and we would write our name out with the tip of the pencil. Okay? But when we're using value, we don't want to use it how we would write. We're going to hold it so that our thumb and our pointer finger are the main fingers holding onto this pencil. I'm using my pointer finger to hold the tip of my pencil really carefully. That'll keep it so that it's flat and even on the paper. And that way, when I press down, I'm going to hold my pencil sideways so that the edge of the graphite is hitting the paper. So when I go back and forth with that, instead of having little lines, I'm actually shading in a surface area that covers in a lot more. And it's a lot smoother. Whereas if I use the tip of my pencil, I'm going to go back and forth and you can really see those lines. This is going to help us with our value. So we're going to go first, figure out where your darkest areas are going to be, and I like to shade in my darkest areas first and figure out where my lightest areas are. We already know my highlight's my lightest area, so I'm going to go into my my cast shadow, which is that shadow that's going to be caused by the light source. It's not actually on my object. So we'll do our cast shadow and our core shadow. My core shadow is going to be pretty dark, so I'm going to go in there and using the side of my pencil, I'm going to shade that area in. Pretty dark. The harder I push, the darker it will be. Now I recognize this is a lot of information all at once on a crazy video. So if at any point you need me to slow down, just pause the video and you can take the time to listen to what I had just said and do what you need to do before you continue. Okay? So this is my core shadow. I'm going to go on to my cast shadow, which should almost be even darker because this area between my object and my ground that it's sitting on is going to get the least amount of light. It's hiding really far in there. So that area where it touches is going to be the darkest spot on my whole object. I'm going to use that side of my pencil again to really shade that in and go through so that I've got a beautiful cast shadow too. Everything else is going to be a mid-tone like we discussed, so I'm going to press a little bit lighter on the other areas. Notice little spots that I think, light's probably not going to hit over in this corner as much, so maybe I'll press a little harder there. Give it a little more of a shadow. You have to think about where that light source is going to hit. Okay, so the same kind of pattern is going to work for our sphere. The only difference here is that we have a very different shaped object. So this shadows that are straight across and flat on this shape, I'm going to think about making them round just like the shape is round. So when I go through, same thing as before, find my light source, figure out where that highlight should be. I can kind of sketch that in to help me remember too. And then I'm going to use the side of my pencil. And instead of shading back and forth, I'm just going to shade in a curved pattern instead. Remembering to press harder where it should be darker and softer where it should be lighter.